and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Hurricane Milton is making its way across central Florida, where nearly 3 million homes and businesses are now without power. We'll, of course, be live in Tampa shortly with the latest, but also to discuss what this means for the U.S. We're joined by Ross Matheson, Bloomberg's EMEA News Director, and we'll look ahead to U.S. CPI and talk China with Rachel Evans, our managing editor for FX and rates in the U.S. and here in Europe. So thank you both for joining us. I mean, it's a big hurricane. This comes on the back of actually also Hurricane Helen that was quite devastating. I mean, what are the implications for the U.S. economy, but also politics?
Well, obviously, it remains to be seen how bad the damage is. Very early indications, perhaps, thankfully, not as bad as had been expected, particularly around the insurance front. So possibly it may not be as a costly hurricane as we thought. But either way, very, very damaging. You can see the expectations still for a storm surge up to 5 feet. That's still a lot. So we're talking about a lot of damage coming on the back, of course, of Hurricane Helene, which caused an enormous amount of damage, months of work to rebuild roads, houses and communities, and a lot of questions about disaster funding, how far that stretches, and then, of course, just the nature of the response from officials and how that plays into the political sphere.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, politics, of course, they'll be probably looking at the Fed. We have, Rachel, that big inflation print today. I mean, I say big because the market is really on tenterhook to try and figure out what the Fed does next. Yeah,
and I think it's interesting that we have kind of the hurricane picture as the backdrop, because that does have implications for the supply chain, which then has implications for inflation. And just kind of given we've had this massive repricing in the market over the last week as a result of kind of that labour market data being stronger than expected, it really has traders on tenterhooks thinking that inflation could be about to rear its head again. So they're looking to stuff that could impact the supply chain. Geopolitical drama in the Middle East, of course, is another inflationary impulse. So I think there's going to be a lot of focus on whether we see these prints come in line or showing some easing, which would be reassuring, but not necessarily reassuring enough to think it's fine, we're going to have more big cuts coming. But to the counter side of that, if we do see inflation sort of even moving a little bit higher, that could reignite, what's been quite a painful sell-off in the Treasury market.
Rachel, do Fed officials look at China and the gyrations and the stocks moving up and down and worry about that?
I think to a degree. I mean, they are always concerned about stability. They obviously have a dual mandate that's very focused on the U.S. economy. They're looking for U.S. labour and they're looking for sort of U.S. inflation. But to the degree that they have market instability to deal with, that is something that they are cognizant of when setting policy. And you do see in all of their statements that they look at kind of that bigger geopolitical kind of picture to kind of determine how comfortable folk are going to be with a decision, particularly if it's one that's going to likely surprise people or be something that would move the market significantly.
Ross, when you look at the hurricane, I mean, again, it's a natural disaster. It's a naturally occurring event. But, does the Biden administration deal with it differently because we're so close to the election?
Well, obviously, you can see that Joe Biden cancelled his trip to Germany to stay at home. We've seen, US officials, including, Kamala Harris, the presidential candidate, being very present. Equally, Donald Trump, trying to show he's very present. And we've seen some incredibly strong language from Joe Biden, really forceful after Donald Trump's comments about, Hurricane Helene, where he was making claims about how much aid people would be getting and claims, that are said to be false about where aid was going. I mean, Biden said there's been relentless, irresponsible, reckless disinformation and lies from Donald Trump. Really strong language from Joe Biden on that. We can see Republican officials on the ground are working with FEMA, the disaster agency. They seem to be saying, we'll just, pile in and get this done together. There doesn't seem to be that, partisan stuff coming in, whereas Donald Trump obviously using it as a campaign issue. No matter what you do in a disaster, it's never fast enough. It's never enough for everybody. It's messy. It's a pretty, a situation where it's hard to get stuff done fast. So no matter what you do, people may not be happy with it. And so really, the upside is potentially for Donald Trump here, even if everyone's working hard, in the aftermath of this, because he's just got the advantage of claiming they're not doing it quickly enough.
And Rachel, I mean, I guess as we get closer to the election, we also try and figure out exactly what it means for dollar strength, the dollar weakness, depending on some of the trade policies. I mean, the policies don't seem clear enough yet to really make a call on FX.
Yeah, and I think, we've seen kind of from the Harris campaign, there's perhaps a lack of clarity around some of her policies. From the Trump campaign, he's talked a lot about tariffs, but then there's this question mark about how much he actually implements, how much of it is talk versus action. So the market is kind of in a bit of wait-and-see mode. You're looking to see who gets in, whether they get, the backing of different parts of Congress, how much power they have as a result of a potential sweep, and then do we actually see some of these policies kind of implemented? On the whole, they seem to be relatively inflationary policies as well. So that would suggest higher yields. That would suggest a stronger dollar, as the Fed wouldn't be able to cut as much.
All right, Rachel, thank you so much. Roz and I will, of course, get an update on the hurricane right now. So let's get straight on the ground, because we're returning to our top story, Central Florida, where Hurricane Milton is making its way across the state. The Category 3 storm made landfall on Wednesday evening with winds now traveling at 85 miles per hour. So for more on this, let's bring in ABC's Rena Roy, who's in Tampa. Rena, what's the latest?
Yeah, well, Francine, you can see behind me that it is a lot quieter out here this morning. But for hours, the winds were whipping and the rain, it was pouring down here. More than 18 inches falling in St. Petersburg alone. Milton making landfall as a powerful Category 3 storm just after 8 p.m. in Siesta Key, packing 120-mile-per-hour winds and spawning deadly tornadoes and catastrophic flooding. The predicted storm surge up to 13 feet, flooding densely populated areas on the coast, including Fort Myers. Tornadoes devastating hundreds of homes, multiple fatalities also reported at a senior community near Fort Pierce on Florida's east coast. The governor says 9,000 National Guardsmen have been mobilized to respond to the storm, along with 1,400 search and rescue first responders. There are also 50,000 linemen on hand to help restore power to the millions who are now without electricity. Francine?
But, Arena, the hurricane has been downgraded at this hour. What does that mean in terms of potential damage?
Right. Well, we know that it is a Category 1 right now, as you mentioned, with 85-mile-per-hour winds. We actually just got an update. I'm looking at my notes just a couple of moments ago. So it has gone down significantly. It is now entering the Atlantic Ocean. It took about 8 hours to cross the peninsula.
Rena, thanks so much. Rena Roy there from ABC News. Of course, stay safe out there. Roz, when you look at some of the political turmoil that could be on the back of it, as you say, there's not a good way to deal with, natural disaster. It's always messy. People on the ground need things faster than any administration can probably give. But the Biden administration is also dealing with a number of, wage negotiations, a number of walkouts. Does that also almost directly translate into the election November 5th?
Well, in a way it does, and in a way it doesn't. I mean, when it comes to some of these disputes, like the port dispute basically got shut down pretty quickly. It didn't get resolved. It just got punted to whoever is going to be president come January. That's a nice present for them as they come in, because it's going to come back again. But obviously we've got the long-running Boeing dispute, for example, and that's affecting workers and as well as the company. And so when you're a candidate, you've got to be careful about where you lie in your comments, because obviously you want to support the company potentially if it's losing money as a big employer, as a big manufacturer in some places to resolve these things, but also you need to show support for workers in their push for better conditions, because they're a voting base. And so you have to be very careful. You can see with the Boeing dispute, for example, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were quite clearly, making comments supportive of the workers in this case, because, again, they are a key voting base. So you can see, all these issues playing into the question around economic policy, and to the point that Rachel was making a minute ago, there's a lack of clarity still about what Kamala Harris would do at the helm economically in terms of her own policies, and how she would manage that, a little untested in those areas. And, in these moments, she's potentially a bit vulnerable there. And so, of course, it does play in. But again, the focus really is still on those key swing states.
Yeah. Roz, thank you so much. As always, Roz Matheson there, Bloomberg's EMEA News Director. Coming up, a conversation with Tiina Lee, 1 year after taking over as Chief Executive of Citigroup UK. That exclusive interview is next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Now, our next guest is in charge of the UK operations of one of the world's biggest banks. Tiina became Citi's UK chief executive a year ago and is one of the most powerful women in banking. Well, Citigroup employs thousands of staff in London as well as several thousand more across Britain. Well, she joins me now to discuss London's future as a hub for financial services and the outlook for the banking sector and, of course, the upcoming Global Investment Summit. Tiina, as always, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your busy schedule. Now, the government has its Global Investment Summit on Monday here in the UK. It'll be one of the first times that international investors really get to know this new administration. Do you think they've done enough to try and attract investment to the UK?
Look, it's early days. I think they've absolutely set out their stall, and it's right that they have put investment and growth at the heart of their strategy. The question is, how do they do it? And what is the role of government in terms of really unlocking private capital? And that's both international capital and domestic capital. So having the opportunity to have this Global Investment Summit next week, I think, is a great opportunity really for the government to set out its stall and really put a little bit more flesh on some of the ideas around, for example, the National Wealth Fund and particularly the role of the UK Infrastructure Bank and the British Business Bank in terms of working with the private sector to de-risk some of these sort of longer-term investments that are so needed in the UK.
Are you optimistic about the prospects of the UK economy, but also, outside investment?
I am, actually. I mean, look, this year we do expect there to be quite sluggish growth in the UK economy. We've only had one interest rate cut so far this year, even though we're expecting another one later on in the year. But we do expect the pace of those cuts to accelerate into 2025. So that does create a positive backdrop for growth. And at the same time, really what we're hearing from clients, and this is both international and domestic, is what they really value is the political stability that has been brought to the UK after the general election, but most importantly, wanting to see predictability and policy stability to allow them to invest in long-dated opportunities.
And so, Tiina, do you think that, the October 30th budget is a really big test for the government, as, again, the Labour Party hasn't been in power for a long time. So what I'm hearing from big international investors is that they want to see really what it's about, and it's the first time we get a proper test.
That's absolutely right. So all attention is really focused on October 30, and we've already seen there's quite a lot of speculation with regard to what is going to be in the budget. We have seen gilt yields rise, over the last week as there have been some concerns around increased investment spending. But certainly I think the government has done the right thing in terms of just setting out their intention around the right guardrails, the fact that that investment is not going to come all in one go. It's going to be phased across the electoral cycle. And most importantly, that they intend on working closely with both the OBR and the National Debt Office or the National Audit Office, because that will reassure both domestic and international investors.
What are you most excited about in the UK? I know there needs to be more IPOs at some point, hopefully. Is London the right place for that?
I think so. I mean, for me, the UK is the gateway to the world. And actually, when we look at the IPO market here in London, it has actually performed pretty well compared to previous years. So we have seen a significant increase in IPOs, admittedly from a low base. It's up about 50% so far this year. But most importantly, those IPOs have performed very well. So I think there is a backdrop with the rising FTSE and the interest rate environment that actually means the backdrop in terms of the macro environment is actually looking broadly positive for 2025. And certainly when we speak to the C-suite and to our corporate clients, they continue to look for opportunities to invest. So that is key. So corporate balance sheets are strong. There's been a lot of financing which has gone on in the debt capital markets, both for M&A financing, hybrid capital refis, liability management exercises. So that means that we don't see much stress in the system, which I think is also important.
You've been in charge of Citigroup UK for a year. How's it been? I mean, there's been a lot going on at the bank.
There has. There's always a lot going on at Citi. But the year has flown by, and I really remain so excited about the opportunity in the UK. Where I've really been focused on is really taking advantage of Citi's global network. We're in 96 different countries, but really focusing on those key trade corridors for us. So we're looking to grow business between London and New York. Of course, US is our home market, but also in fast-growing regions such as the Middle East and in countries such as India. So for me, it's not just about our banking business, but is also about how can we deliver one city through our markets, our wealth, and of course our world-class services franchise.
Tiina, thanks so much. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and we'll also talk about some of the risks out there and really what clients are asking you on how to deal with that volatility. Tiina Lee, Chief Executive of Citi UK, stays with us. We'll also talk possible bank consolidation. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Still with us, Tiina Lee, Chief Executive of Citi UK. Tiina, thank you so much for staying with us. Now, we're basically 1 year on from the biggest reorganization of Citigroup, with the Chief Executive, Jane Fraser, putting a number of things in place. And you were talking about how you're also taking advantage of some of the unique challenges but opportunities that you have. What's been the biggest difference?
So we have really simplified our management structures. It sounds very mundane, but things like fewer committees, fewer meetings, fewer management layers. We've reduced management layers, in some cases down to sort of 12 from 15, 16, 17. So that means we're able to really speed up decision making much better and drive accountability. So that really has been, I think, the biggest change.
Will you hire people in the UK now that you've do you have it where you want it to be?
We're pretty much at the right size. We will continue to hire selectively as we always have done. So we've recently had our new head of our commercial bank for the UK join. He joined last week, James Morris. And of course, at our most senior levels, we've been able to hire some really world-class talent, with Viz Raghavan joining as head of banking, Tim Ryan in terms of technology. So it is less about actually hiring significantly. We'll always be strategic around needing to fill roles. But at the same time, we have a really deep bench at Citi, so it's also around giving people within our own organisation the ability to step up.
Tiina, when you look at Europe, I mean, the banking world was like alight with speculation and then I guess almost confirmation that there could be a merger, although the Germans don't want it, between Commerzbank and UniCredit. How does that change the banking landscape and your world?
So, I mean, the European banking sector has been highly fragmented forever. And there has been lots of discussion over the years around the need for banking union, capital markets union. So certainly from our perspective, I mean, we have a significant presence in Europe in many different countries. So for us, really, any developments that require or actually allow for a greater free flow of capital across the region, we would welcome, because that allows us to deliver our cross-border capabilities more effectively. So we look on with interest.
But is it a litmus test of whether there's appetite for political banking consolidation?
I think it's certainly going to be an important moment for European banks, and I think it's interesting both some of the comments that have come out from Mario Draghi in his most recent report around competitiveness in the EU, around regulation, and again the need to drive capital markets union. I think all plays into this next phase.
Tiina, when you look at, I guess the banking landscape here in London, I know you're committed to Canary Wharf, but also maybe looking at other places. What do you think happens to Canary Wharf?
Well, as you know, Francine, we are committed to Canary Wharf. We're in the middle of a significant renovation of our iconic City Tower. That's going to be completed in the middle of 26. So when that's done, we will have 10,000 people in London, the majority of which will be at the wharf. So I think it's a great environment to work in, and I think what Shobi is doing with regard to that mixed use, I think is to be welcomed. We also have 4,000 people in Belfast, so that has grown from the low 200s about 20 years ago. So again, that is a region that we are very committed to.
Tiina, thank you so much, as always, for coming on. Tiina Lee there, Chief Executive of Citigroup UK. Now, coming up, as interest rates fall and investors return, we discuss the outlook for the property sector with Jonathan Goldstein. He's the Chief Executive of Cain International. He's also on the board of Chelsea Football Club. That conversation is up next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Hurricane Milton makes its way across central Florida, carrying with it extreme winds and flash flooding. We'll bring you the latest throughout the morning. European stocks and futures pretty muted after the S&P's record high yesterday. U.S. inflation data out later is set to define Fed policy in the coming months. And Michel Barnier's make-or-break budget. The French Prime Minister is set to unveil his plans to narrow the deficit. We'll have the details on what to expect. So back to our top story. Hurricane Milton has battered Florida with heavy wind and rain. Now, more than 3 million people are also without power. Let's get more on, of course, some of the financial consequences. Investors in catastrophe bonds are preparing for substantial losses. So we're joined by Gautam Naik, Bloomberg's ESG editor. Thank you for joining us. So what are the likely scale of losses for investors in these so-called cat bonds?
Hi, good morning. So it looks like the cat bond market has avoided the worst-case scenario. As of now, I've only seen one estimate, and insured losses could be anywhere from 20 billion to 60 billion. That's mainly because Milton hit further south in the Tampa Bay area around Sarasota. If there's a $20 billion loss, insured loss, then it looks like the cat bond market may not even take any hit. But if it's up to about 60 billion, it could be a 4% decline.
So how has the market evolved, Gautam? I mean, it seems bigger, but as there are more dangerous storms becoming more common, does it change the way that, prices are set going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So already reinsurance prices are quite high, and insurers are having to take the brunt of the current damage that storms, but also other natural disasters are causing. It looks like that there will be a further increase if there's significant losses from Hurricane Milton. And the cat bond market itself has grown quite a bit. Last year was a record level of issuance. It looks like this year's on track also to hit a record level of issuance. It's an indication that insurers are increasingly and reinsurers are increasingly trying to pass on some of this natural catastrophe risk to Wall Street.
Gautam, thank you so much. Gautam Naik there, Bloomberg's ESG editor. Now, investor interest in returning to Europe's real estate sector with the onset of rate cuts and bottomed out valuations. Now, higher rates and shifting work dynamics had plunged the industry into turmoil, with many landlords forced to sell assets. To discuss the outlook for the sector, I'm joined by Jonathan Goldstein, the chief executive of Cain International. Now, the firm operates in the UK, Europe, and the US and manages more than $16 billion in assets. He may also sit on the Chelsea Football Club board. Jonathan, thank you so much and welcome, of course, to the Pulse. Now, is U.S. capital starting to flow back into some of these real estate assets as they become more attractive, or certainly as they're stabilizing?
I think you're absolutely right. Firstly, good morning. Obviously, the last 24, 36 months have been challenging for the real estate industry, but we're really beginning to see signs that core capital is coming back to the marketplace. A rate shifts, people really feeling that the Fed cut, the Bank of England cut, has begun to see a progression towards lower interest rates, has brought capital back to the market. We're seeing it all over the space. And that's giving confidence back to existing owners, but also to investors. You'll still see real strong focus on the credit aspects of the industry. People have really focused on that in the last 5 years. But as rates decline, obviously the return on capital in those areas comes back. And that, again, will drive more people into making more investments and give greater stability to the industry.
So where's that money being deployed? Is it specifically in the UK because politically it's certainly more stable than what we've seen in the past?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, the UK government, the changing government, has provided at least a 5-year outlook of stability and a lack of noise that we had in the previous, 10 years. And I think, you're seeing next week there's a big international investor summit on Monday in London where, the government has brought together some of the great world leaders in business to try and show that Britain is back and Britain's back in business. And I think that is going to lead to another inflow of capital. We've seen it across the UK from Amazon, from Blackstone, from others in the course of the last 12 weeks. And I'm convinced that that will continue as we continue down this road of a softening in interest rates and greater economy, a view that the soft landing will happen, that there won't be recession. And that would give increased investment and increased confidence in the UK.
Jonathan, when you look at student housing, in which Cain invests, it's been doing pretty well compared to the rest of the sector. But there's concerns about visa, about tuition fees going up. How do you see that developing?
Well, again, I think the previous administration was sending mixed messages to people. Did we want people here? Did we not want people here? And I think now that we look forward in a more stable environment, people will see the UK as a great place to come. We've got some of the great educational establishments. We've invested substantially into the sector and continue to do so. In fact, we're doing another transaction this week, actually in Bristol, because we're seeing great growth in this marketplace as people wish to be in the UK. And I think it's this consistency of message that enables people to both invest and to see the UK as a trusted partner again, which I think is hugely important.
But the budget seems crucial, October 30th. I mean, and I guess the path to narrow the landing path is extremely tight to make sure that investors continue coming back in.
I think you make a great point.
What do you need from the government?
I think you make a great point. I think that the government has a very difficult balancing act, in its hands. And I think it needs to ensure that obviously it raises the revenue it needs to do, that it taxes in the right way, taxes in the right areas, but also ensures that business feels incentivised to carry on investing in the UK. And I think all the messaging we're hearing is that they're hearing that message, they're understanding that message, and I'm convinced that the budget will be appropriately balanced so that people will still feel that the UK is a great place to invest.
When you look at real estate in Europe, there were concerns about valuations, or maybe some of the sellers wanted too high a price. Has that adjusted itself?
No, it hasn't. I think Europe is slow. Europe has been slow in certain areas. Certainly Germany and France have been very soft. Obviously, if you go further east into Poland, it's still affected by the geopolitical issues in the Ukraine and the knock-on effect into Poland. So I think Poland, I think Europe has, been slower to react. We're beginning to see stronger signs in the UK and in the US than we are in Europe. But, I think, look, the greatest challenge we have out there is geopolitical. We obviously have the ongoing, terrible atrocities in the Ukraine, and obviously the Middle East is a very challenging area, both of which pose real threats to the global economy. And I think from an economic perspective, an investor perspective, obviously one would want to see, and from a humanitarian perspective, people would want to see those resolved as quickly as possible.
But we heard from Jamie Dimon and Ray Dalio this week, and actually they were not so convinced that interest rate cuts were continuing, partly because of inflation, partly because of all these geopolitical risks. Does that change, where you see your sector going if interest rates have to go back up in the next 12 months? No,
I think absolutely. I think the consequence of the Fed cutting their rates was that people were no longer talking about a rate cut, but they actually saw one in effect. And therefore people could actually feel the impact of that. The big outlier out there is if interest rates were to reverse back the other way. If the result of increased inflation or the result of geopolitical situations was to cause a rise in interest rates again, I think that would cause a seismic shock to the industry. I think, we found in 2023 that people went into the year believing the interest rates cuts were coming. And I think people, spent the whole year being disappointed, and that created a sense of gloom around the industry. I think if we went back into that environment in late 24 or 25, I do think there'd be a lot of downside risk.
Jonathan, talk to me about football, because it's of course, you're on the board of Chelsea Football Club. Is there anything going on at Earl's Court that actually Stamford Bridge could move there?
Look, we've discussed this before, you and I. The development of a stadium in central London is a very complex operation. Chelsea hired he's now the head of the management board, Jason Gannon. He developed SoFi in Los Angeles, one of the world's great stadia. And he's really focused now on a day-to-day basis on bringing the right solution to the club. The shareholder group is really focused on ensuring that Chelsea remains, a world-leading football club, both in the men's and the women's teams. And in both the men's and the women's, they've started the season really strongly. And we will bring the right result for the supporters as we come forward, because we want to ensure that Chelsea is at the top of the game globally. So that's maybe for Earl's Court, or do you think you've missed the boat? Well, I don't think I want to sit here and rule anything out. What we're very keen on is ensuring that we have a world-leading stadium going forward. Is it still fun? Being part of a football club? It's always fun. Football's a great sport. Chelsea is a world-leading club, and we're all very proud to be associated with it.
Do you see more money coming in from the US?
Well, I think we're seeing it at the moment. Everton Football Club's just traded to an American. I think, and obviously that's good to provide stability to Everton after some turbulent years. And I think that's a trend that will continue over the coming years.
Do you think it changes the game?
I think at the heart of it, this is a sport that's owned by the supporters. And I think the minute you forget that and you lose contact with your supporter base, then I think the sport's in trouble. And I think one of the great things about the Premier League over the years, with all the broadcasting, with all the globalisation, it's still a supporter-led business. The passion that you see in Premier League games is second to none. And I'm sure that will continue over the years.
Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. And congratulations also on an ever-expanding family.
Thank you very much.
We had good news this week. Jonathan Goldstein, their chief executive of Cain International. Now, Bloomberg understands that Bernard Arnault's family is nearing the purchase, talking about football, of a majority stake in second-tier football club Paris FC. Now, the billionaire who controls luxury conglomerate LVMH is set to invest in the football team alongside Red Bull. Paris FC is currently the leader of France's Ligue 2. One step below the top league. Coming up, make or break, France is set to announce its budget later today with the pressure firmly on the Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, to reduce the country's budget deficit. We'll bring you the details next, and this is Bloomberg.
We need to keep on negotiating. We need to keep all avenues for dialogue open to find a conclusion, a negotiated conclusion, which is actually valid for both parties. It's important also for us, not only in terms of being able to protect a key strategic sector going forward, but also think in medium term to avoid an escalation of protectionist measures, which would be a lose-lose for both areas.
Well, that was the Spanish Economy Minister, Carlos Cuerpo, speaking exclusively with Bloomberg's Priti Gupta in Madrid yesterday, where they discussed trade measures with Beijing as well as Spain's budget and economy. Now, let's turn our focus to Germany, where the economy is heading for its second straight annual contraction. The government has revised down its output projection for 2024, the latest sign that Europe's biggest economy is struggling to shake off a prolonged period of weakness. Well, Germany's economy minister says a slow recovery is likely to take root next month. Well, later this evening, France will also be unveiling its annual budget. The Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, is facing a number of economic challenges, with many having different theories on how best to tackle them.
The French economy has been kind of getting away with fiscal murder for a very long time.
This cabinet seems to be committed to continue the pro-competitiveness agenda.
I expect the government to be very, very serious on diminishing public spendings, because it's absolutely necessary. And if you concentrate only on taxes, you will only weaken the economy.
The question is not what government we will have in France, but when it falls, when it collapses. And it could take some months.
I wouldn't speak about austerity measures. I would speak more, as I said, on responsibility, accountability to people.
We need to straighten the ship very quickly if we don't want to get into much more troubled waters.
I'm quite confident that they will do their best to tackle what is on the table.
The goal is to convince all the observers, market participants, investors, savers, that they can trust that indeed France is going in the right direction.
Now, for more on all of this, we're joined by Bloomberg's Cain from Paris. Cain, good morning. Now, the French budget will finally be unveiled tonight. What can we expect?
Austerity in order to restore credibility. We know that Michel Barnier is looking for 60 billion euros. 2/3 will come from savings, 1/3 from tax hikes. In terms of savings, what do we know so far? The new finance minister, Antoine Armand, has said that about half of the 40 billion euros of savings will actually come from freezing or capping the budgets of the ministries at the state level. Some public servants will not be replaced. Some public services will be merged. There will be less incentives for apprenticeship, for R&D, for example. The social security will also contribute with less payments, for example, for sick days, and also an impact on retirees with the indexation of pension on inflation delayed for at least 6 months. Then, in terms of how is he going to find an extra 20 billion euros of revenues? Well, of course, tax hikes. Tax hikes, we've talked already about this exceptional tax on big companies generating more than 1 billion euros of revenues. That should target about 300 French companies. And some of the big names out there like LVMH, Engie, Vinci, Bouygues could actually be affected, according to Morgan Stanley, and up to as much as 5% of their net income. So quite significant impact. Finally, in terms of wealthy individuals, well, if you are part of the 0.3% richest French people, those who are a couple without children earning more than 500,000 euros a year, then the income tax will increase.
Are these measures, Karine, going to be enough to bring the deficit down and please Brussels?
It remains to be seen, because you know that Brussels has already placed France under this excessive deficit procedure. And even with all these 60 billion euros of savings, the deficit is only going to get back to 5% of GDP next year from more than 6% this year. French debt also is set to continue to rise to as much as 115% of GDP next year. And French debt has consistently risen over the past 25 years. It was 60% only, for example, under President Jacques Chirac. We'll actually almost see the reaction immediately, because we're getting an assessment from Fitch, a credit rating agency, as soon as tomorrow night. Remember, they already downgraded France last year. And also, of course, it remains to be seen how long this Barnier government actually survives. It already survived its first vote of no confidence on Tuesday night, because the National Rally of Marine Le Pen didn't support the motion of censure from the left wing. But of course, everything is in the hands of Marine Le Pen, and we'll see exactly how long she waits until she pulls the rug.
Karine, thank you so much. Karine Conan there with the very latest on the French budget. Now, Bloomberg understands that Stellantis chief executive Carlos Tavares is planning a deep management reshuffle in response to the automaker's disastrous profit warning. Now, Tavares may present his proposal at a board of directors meeting in the U.S. this week. The car maker is struggling with waning demand and high inventory. Then shares in GSK are soaring this morning. That's after the UK drug maker agreed to pay up to $2.2 billion to settle its Zantac liability cases. Now, the settlement will resolve almost all 80,000 U.S. court cases over allegations its old Zantac medication was contaminated with a suspected carcinogen. Well, GSK has denied liability. Coming up, a bit of turbulence for Airbus after its orders and deliveries dip more than expected. This is Bloomberg. Well, Airbus deliveries fell 9% in September to 50 aircraft compared with the same month last year. It comes as rival Boeing faces its own problems, including a strike by workers, which has shut large parts of its manufacturing. Now, we're joined by Sid Philip, our global aviation reporter. So, Sid, good morning, first of all, but what do these Airbus deliveries in September mean for their full-year outlook?
Yeah, morning, Francine. So for Airbus, this is another sort of sign that their full-year target, which they had to cut in June, they had previously planned for 800 deliveries. They reduced it to 770. And even now, that may be a stretch because of the fact that their supply chain is so backed up that they can't produce enough aircraft. And that's been a really big toll on their sort of deliveries and their outlook for deliveries.
Sid, why has Airbus not been able to capitalize on the troubles that Boeing's had?
So Airbus has really struggled with supply chains from the sort of run-up after the pandemic. Suppliers cut back staff, they cut back workers, and they've been sort of had to scale up production since the pandemic. And that's still not back to where it should be. And so Airbus has had to change its targets multiple times, including its long-term targets for raising production and their short-term targets in terms of annual production. And the problem for Airbus is that even if one part is missing, they can't put a plane together. So they've talked about how engines and interiors are a big sort of pain point for them at the moment, and that's sort of holding back deliveries at them.
How is their position different to Boeing, though?
So Airbus is in a sort of different position than Boeing because, I mean, on one hand, Airbus is struggling with supplies, whereas Boeing is sort of struggling on multiple counts in terms of they have issues with production, in terms of the strike that they have at the moment with their workforce, which is now entering its 4th week. You've also got the FAA restricting production on the 737 MAX following the blowout in January, and then they have sort of other issues with cash flow and everything else. So Airbus should have been able to capitalize on Boeing's woes, but unfortunately they can't even deliver aircraft even to their own customers in the quantities that they promised.
Sid, thank you so much. Sid Phillip there with the very latest, of course. On Airbus yesterday, we spent a long time talking about Boeing. Now, we have a big day, a big markets day, actually, today because we have inflation data out of the U.S. a little bit later on. Pretty much, stocks are kind of steady today. I guess they settled into this holding pattern ahead of the U.S. inflation data that should provide a little bit of clues on the Fed's policy path. Now, U.S. consumer price data is expected to show that inflation is moderating further, and that would support the Fed's anticipated easing in the coming months. In the wake of the surprisingly strong job growth for September that was reported last Friday, the gradually slowdown in price pressures, though, suggests that policymakers will opt for possibly a smaller interest rate cut when they meet next month. So overall, we're looking also at, for example, the 10-year yield. We had a big repricing last time, so let's look cross-asset about what the 10-year yield is doing at the moment. Again, minutes of the last policy meeting showed that a majority of FOMC minutes supported a 50 basis point cuts, but again, there was a preference among some officials to cut rates at a more gradual pace. So we'll have plenty more, not only on the U.S., but we'll have a lot more, of course, on China. These Chinese stocks jumping around after the release of details on stimulus measures, with China's central bank setting up a swap facility to provide liquidity to international investors to buy stocks. Up next, a Bloomberg brief, Danny Berger in New York, and this is Bloomberg.